Hello. For this video, we're going to talk about Gloria Anzaldua's book, Borderlands, La Frontera. And before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about feminism as a philosophy, as a theory, because Gloria Anzaldua's book is a part of a section for this week on intersectional feminism. And I've chosen that because that is the contemporary thrust of the feminist movement and where feminist philosophy is at. And feminist philosophy is one of the most influential discourses, philosophies, perspectives on our contemporary questions and struggles about what it means to be human and how we understand human value. But before we get to Gloria Anzaldúa, we'll backtrack to the beginning of feminism. This video may be a little bit longer than some other ones, but hopefully I can keep it to the same length as the other ones. So with feminism, feminism largely starts with liberalism, the emergence of liberalism, right? And at this moment, I want to be clear that feminism is not the only philosophy or worldview to care about equality between genders and sexes, or one that centered women in any kind of way. Lots of different cultures throughout time and history have had a wide ranging perspectives on and attitudes towards differences between what was perceived as men and what was perceived as what was in women, right? Now, that aside, feminism has become the dominant framework, for better or for worse, according to people within feminism or outside of it. So it's important to trace where it comes from and why it has the questions and perspective that it has. So it begins, as we said, with liberalism, right? Liberalism asserts that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, right? That an individual should be their own property by virtue of the effort that they do to work the land, that the government is supposed to protect individuals and from itself, from its like ability to remove or trample the inherent rights that everyone has. And so this idea that everyone has rights and everyone's fundamentally equal and the government's supposed to protect that equality and protect the property and protect the rights that everyone has, after the Revolutionary War is successful and the United States established itself as a liberal democracy, there are two groups that immediately like, yeah, okay, like we're ready for the next step of this, right? One is black people who are saying, okay, so slavery is over, racial discrimination is over, right? Like liberal, like we get the fire of liberalism, we love it. And the founding fathers like, no, not quite, right? You don't, as we talked about race, you don't quite count as a human in the same way. And then on the other hand, the other group was women who were like, yeah, we're all equal. We can have property. We can do what we want, right? Freedom is the spirit of this country. And once again, the people were saying, actually, no, not quite, right? You're not, once again, you're not as fully human as a man. And this is why intersectional feminism is such an interesting perspective because it's bringing together two different strands of people who've been dehumanized and trying to say that for us to be counted as full humans, it means society is going to have to change in some kind of fundamental way, right? So the first branch of feminism is often called waves because the different waves have different concerns. So the first wave starts with shortly after the end of the Revolutionary War and continues up until about 1920. And that wave is basically trying to get the benefits of liberalism to truly be applied to women, right? That women are equal to men, right? If liberalism says we're all equal, then that should apply to women. And so a lot of the feminist movement during that time, it wasn't necessarily called the feminist movement then, but a lot of it was arguing for why women were equal to men. Women were not more necessarily more emotional in a way that was harmful. Women should be educated. They should learn. They should have influence in society. They are meant to do more than just be mothers, right? They should be able to be scientists and novelists and all these kinds of people. And so there's a push for we're equal. We have the same capacity. And nothing was represented for this capacity more than the ability to vote, which is why a lot of people end the wave at 1920, because that's when women were given the right to vote in the United States. And so I'm obviously moving through a lot of history and time by saying that, but generally the ethos is that yes, we are equal. We should be developed just like men should be developed. We have the same capacity as humans as men do, right? This notion that certain abilities are inherently in us based on our sexual organs and hormones and things like that. There was a began to be a resistance to that perspective, and the idea is that equality as an ideal should expand to everyone. Now, after 1920, you get a different mood. People call this the second wave, which goes from about, people disagree about some of these timelines, but about 1920 to 1960s, 1970, right? And actually, definitely before, after the 60s, probably like 1970s, early 80s. And that had to do with women's empowerment, right? Which is different than equality, right? Women's empowerment dealt with the fact that, well, while that women have power or are gaining more power, what should we do with it? And if the first wave was much more concerned with equality, well, the second wave was much more concerned with difference, as in what issues should women uniquely care about, right? What issues do women have to put their power to that maybe men don't care about, or men don't want to, or men refuse? Maybe men are against this, women having power in these areas. And so a lot of times when people say, oh, I thought feminism was about equality, that's kind of true, mainly in the first wave. But by the time you get to the second wave, the issue of equality still continues, of course. But there's already this discussion of, well, we have some things we care about that for us to actualize our potential as humans, we need to deal with, right? So the first of those is a big issue becomes abortion, right? Which is, should women have the right? Should it be understood as a right? Now we say you're violating my rights, but it wasn't clear that abortion was a right that a person could have. And I don't mean that in a way that people are just so ignorant they couldn't understand it was a right. I mean that as in it wasn't clear that rights applied to that situation. And in fact, the right to abortion is not directly guaranteed directly through just a right to bodily autonomy. It's actually a right to privacy. That the idea that the federal government shouldn't be able to intervene between a person who's getting abortion and their doctor. So it's not even that idea that you have such bodily autonomy that has to be respected. That discourse developed and continued during the second wave into the third wave, but it's much more about privacy. So, so abortion was a large issue, right? Another issue was the idea of women's sexual autonomy, right? Which was the idea that women should be able to have sex if they want to. They shouldn't be afraid. They shouldn't be ashamed. They should be feel comfortable in their bodies in certain kinds of ways. And that had to do with the release of the birth control pill and other things like that, right? So these are some of the ideas that began to gain momentum and steam. Now, there also began to be the equal opportunity perspective, right? Where it wasn't just about voting, it was also about wanting to be able to have a career and push through those barriers, right? And a big thing that did that was World War II, where a lot of women in the United States had to work jobs that were traditionally male jobs because the men were gone, right? And when the men came back, some women were like, okay, yeah, I'll go back to what I was doing before. But a lot of women were like, actually, this was cool. Like, I enjoy being able to make money. I enjoy being able to, I can do these things, right? It's not that as a woman, I can't do them. I just don't have the technical brain or the capacity or the strength to run machinery and do all these things. I actually can do it. So now it's a different conversation that we have to have about creating an opportunity for anyone to do what they want to do. This is still liberalism, which values individual desires, right? We think about John Stuart Mill, right? That a person, you should have the opportunity to do what you want. If you choose to be a housewife or choose to take additional woman's job, like at that time, like a nurse or hairdresser or something like that. It's totally fine. But you should have the ability to do whatever you want, right? Now, at that time, there's another branch of feminism that emerges during the second wave. It's called radical feminism. Radical means to the root. And so radical feminists say, well, no, it's not the fact that women haven't been expanded the rights of liberalism, right? That they're not treated as individuals who have freedom of speech and freedom of choice and freedom of all these other things, right? The issue is fundamentally something different. And this is where a word that's very popular now has emerged. The issue is something called patriarchy. Patriarchy meaning literally rule by elder men. It's often been taken to mean to be ruled by men, but in reality, it's ruled by elder men, patriarchs, right? And so, just like the liberal philosophy had to overthrow monarchy and replace it with democracy, right? And liberal thought democracy is the form of government. Monarchies are incompatible with liberal theory. Hobbes, we talked about a long time ago. Thomas Hobbes was one of the people who tried to argue that monarchy, a strong monarchy, and liberal theory work together. In fact, they were needed, necessary for one another. But the founding fathers and most other theorists, and especially the big revolution in France, America, all the leaders of that believed that democracy was the central governance system for a liberal society. So radical feminists started to say something similar. Yeah, it's patriarchy. There's a fundamental structure, a power imbalance that men have an investment in controlling women, right? And so there began to be this theory articulating what patriarchy is, why men benefit from it, and how basically patriarchy needs to be overthrown. And that's why it's called radical feminism, because the idea is that there's a deeper change in society that needs to occur. We need to, it's almost like I said, something the founding fathers, get rid of monarchy, so let's get rid of patriarchy, replace it with something else. And the radical feminists didn't necessarily agree on what that was. Some said, hey, we can have a genderless society. Gender itself only comes from patriarchy, right? Some people argue we should have a matriarchy. We should put women in charge. Some people argue that we should move to communism or socialism, but we need to get rid of patriarchy to do that first. There are wide ranging perspectives, but they all agreed that patriarchy was the fundamental problem. And they articulated lots of ways that men benefited from being able to a dominance of women, right? And the reason why I emphasize that rule by elder men is because, from feminist analysis, patriarchy isn't really that great for a lot of men in a political sense. A lot of men don't have much power in relationship to men above them in the hierarchical patriarchal system. This is the theory, right? But what they do gain is power over women, right? And in exchange from having a lot of power in society, that the powerful men can have tons of wealth and influence and power and control everything, but the men all get to control the women in their lives, right? The men get access to women's bodies in certain kinds of ways, to see them and to be able to touch them and violate them, as a lot of radical feminists would argue, in various kinds of ways, verbally or physically, and get away with it just fine. Like that's the power you get in exchange for submitting to being ruled by a more powerful man and having more less wealth and influence than you should. As a man, you get women in a certain kind of way. Another very controversial issue during that time was pornography. For radical feminists, most radical feminists at the time, pornography was fundamentally misogynistic. Pornography was something that largely men consumed, was largely made for men's needs, and basically displayed women largely as objects of desire. It dehumanized them. This is a class on human nature. They felt that pornography fundamentally dehumanized women. And therefore, that was another one of the benefits, right? Is that I may not have a lot of power in society, but I can go and watch all kinds of women be naked and do all kinds of sexual acts and enjoy that, right? And many of those women, if they had a chance to do something else, probably wouldn't do what they're doing, right? There's a need for that to appease men because a lot of men aren't happy with not having as much influence in society as they should because patriarchies are a few group of powerful men dominate society, right? So that is something that really characterized the two sides. The liberal feminists kind of continued with trying to expand liberalism, trying to frame the feminist movement in terms of equal opportunity. You should be able to do whatever you want in society, have access to the institutions of society to really truly be kind of equal. But then radical feminism starts to emerge. Another big issue for radical feminism was sexual assault of all kinds. The liberal feminist movement did not talk about that. And that was considered to be the number one most horrific thing that made a lot of women believe so strongly in the patriarchal system. How could you be comfortable with that? Like that was a lot of women were thinking. How could you be comfortable with the fact that your people you claim the people you love, like your sister, your mother, your daughter, your cousin, could be horribly violated by usually by a man generally, right? And then the blame goes to the person, to the woman. And no one wants to change to stop this from happening. No one wants to say, "Hey, let's stop it from happening. Let's do a big cultural movement to change it." Like so many of us know, we're the ones in charge. We're the protectors of the family. We're men, and so many of us have witnessed our women in our lives be hurt severely. There wasn't that kind of response. Where's the chivalry, right? Where's the protection? And so that links to the patriarchy, where people begin to say, oh, it's because that's part of the benefit, is that women can get repressed that way. It's a number one way that women can be repressed. They're scared, they're terrified to be out at night, to be in so many spaces. And when they get in certain spaces, they can be violated, and that makes them leave or not try their best. So the idea is that the theory is that, well, that's a benefit to the men in society to be able to violate a woman whenever they want to, right? And then kind of stop, change courses and things like that, right? So this is the theory, this is the perspective, right? So there's big debates, lots of clashing, and you get to the third wave, which starts in the 80s up until around now. Some people say Me Too has begun a fourth wave, but it's debatable. But there begins to be this kind of a different task. One, the liberal feminist perspective generally wins on pornography, right? Pornography is not considered to be something that inherently devalues women or makes them into objects. It's turned into something that, in the frame of equal opportunity, as hey, it's something that can be empowering. It's something that can give women money. They can be free to use their body, it's sexual liberation, right? That they should be able to do what they want with themselves. So therefore, pornography becomes understood as generally a good thing. And and of course, abortion, which all sides of the feminist movement were arguing for, becomes a protection. That's a protected right of a sort. Now, the other thing that starts to happen is there begins to be this questioning of womanhood. Like, what is a woman? Who is this woman that supposedly the feminist movement represents their interests and what they desire, right? And there are two directions that kind of that emerge in this question. One I'll just mention, the other we'll actually focus on because it'll help us transition to Anzaldua. The first one deals with what we now will call trans, non-binary, queer, right? These other perspectives of that are not just women only, right? That there's more to gender than just being a woman, right? Or a man. There's people in between. And the question is the feminist movement going to represent them as well, right? Is the feminist movement a movement for women, or is it a movement that's critical of the restrictions of gender upon people? That's one of the core questions the movement begins to face, and it's still facing now, right? Which is it the gender critical perspective, or is it advocating for a particular understanding of woman, and where does that sense of woman come from, right? The second one deals with a lot of what we now call women of color, women who are Asian and African and Black American and all the different indigenous, all different kinds of people start to say, "Wait, this doesn't reflect me." And we'll talk about this more with Gloria Anzaldua, but also Audre Lorde. But a lot of people are saying a lot of what the feminist movement claims to be about, a lot of how they're defining womanhood, is really centered in whiteness, right? That's not what I want. like a quick example, which we'll talk about a bit more with the other video, but a lot of black women, indigenous women, Mexican American women, a lot of them said abortion isn't the thing I care about most in terms of reproductive rights. I want to be able to have a kid and have that kid grow up to an adult. I still want the basic right to be able to reproduce. That's what I understand reproductive rights to be, like the ability to literally reproduce. What is reproduction? To have a child and have that child grow and develop to kind of replace you, right? And I still can't do that. Our kids are dying at childbirth, our kids are malnutrition, our kids are getting shot, our kids are being undereducated, our kids are being malnourished. I still can't reproduce. And you're all telling me that all of our inner movements, energy, and thought should be focused on not choosing to not reproduce if you don't want to. That's cool. Respect that. Love that. But we still have to focus on the ability to reproduce. Not everyone has the secure protections in wanting to reproduce themselves, right? So that's just an example. And then, of course, racism and other things like that, right? So, with that background, what I think is really important to understand the contemporary landscape, we can move to Anzaldua. And so, Anzaldua is a Chicana feminist, and the Chicana comes from the Chicano movement. And the Chicano movement was a movement for Mexican Americans to assert themselves as their own identity. Same thing we see with the Black Power movement, with the American Indian movement. At the same time, Mexican Americans saying, hey, we have our own unique culture, our own unique perspective that we need to assert and grow and protect ourselves. Just, we're not failed Mexicans who aren't Mexican enough and who are just kind of hostile and like invaders in the American soil, right? We're not just bad Mexicans, but we're also not just Americans, right? We are in between. We're something new. We speak Spanglish. We speak our own dialect. We mix English. We've been born in the United States. We do all these types of things. Many people have been, like I said, people have been in the United States of Mexican descent for centuries by the time you get to the 1960s because of the way certain territories were brought into the United States, right? So you have people who can literally say in 1960, yeah, my family's been in this area for 100 years, 150 years sometimes, right? So like what like how could I not be American just because this area was Mexico before it got brought in? And I'm not talking about when it legally became a state, but just as a territory was taken, right? So that becomes that movement. But then, of course, the feminist movement is growing. And so a lot of women who are Chicana are not having equal power, not having influence. There's a lot of problems and unfair things going on. So people start to say, well, we need Chicana movement, right? We need to bring ourselves forward as women who also have this Mexican American identity. And that's where Gloria Anzaldua is really working to try to illuminate this. And so, what is she concerned about in this perspective? Well, first of all, we're going to skip the first chapter and focus mostly on the seventh one. But in the first chapter, she essentially says that her central argument is that Mexico and the United States are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Mexico, she argues later, I think maybe in the first chapter, but essentially, Mexico isn't what it is without the United States. So much of the drugs that are ravaging Mexico and the cartels, who's buying them? Who has the money to make the drug trade into a $1 billion enterprise? The United States, right? All the cocaine, the weed that we sold with Colombia. It's just largely people in the United States buying it. Obviously, it's going other places too, like in the rest of the world. Don't get me wrong. The United States is a huge influence on the wealth that comes from the drug trade. Then you have the North American Trade Agreement that basically made it so that it was cheaper to buy American products than Mexican ones. It devastated northern Mexico, which was mostly agricultural, because we make so much corn in the United States. Well, we could flood Mexico with corn. It made them the NAFTA was what it was called. Was it made it so that different tariffs or taxes were not applied between goods moving in North America. And so it meant that it could become cheaper to buy corn for the United States than homegrown corn. And so farming became really, really difficult, right? So this is what Gloria Anzaldua is talking about, is that you want to, United States actually extends into Mexico. The reality is that Mexico is kind of a part of the United States. It's a part, and this is her view. It's a part we don't want to claim, but we've shaped their economy. We've shaped in the ways that matter. Right? We've shaped their economy and in such deep ways that Mexico is essentially very much dependent on the United States. And the evidence of that is all the people leaving and coming to the United States. But she says instead of accepting that reality that we've created because of our economic interests, we then want to pretend, we want not necessarily pretend, but we believe that these people are invaders who are overburdening our systems and doing all these things, which is Americans can't accept that. No, this is a we've already kind of gobbled up Mexico. And in the 90s and 2000s, it was good when we're getting all this wealth and prosperity because we've basically turned their economy into something that buys from us. But now their economy is gotten really weak. And so people start coming here. But for Gloria Anzaldua, the border is not just a real place that is a line between countries. It's also something that has metaphysical, as in what it ultimately exists, and metaphorical, symbolic significance because she grew up on the border, right? So she's like, I couldn't easily go between both. And that for her, that border is not really real. It's something that's an imposition upon reality, right? This is what the metaphysical significance is, that we ultimately believe that the boundaries between us are more real than they are. And she says some people, they have a strong investment in boundaries because they're afraid of change. But they're also afraid of the truth. The truth being that where life is constantly blending, right? Our skin is a great example. It seems so, you know, closed, but as you know, it has lots of holes in it for us to be able to release and let in things if necessary. It absorbs. It's a membrane, but it can block what doesn't need to come in, but it also absorbs a lot more and releases a lot more. Right? So the idea for and they'll do is that borders are something that we're too heavily invested in. We're too heavily invested in boundaries. We're ultimately, and this is where we get to chapter 7, very uncomfortable with ambiguity. Ambiguity meaning something being more than one thing at the same time. A lot of people are deeply uncomfortable with that. And there's lots of reasons for that. But her argument is that the more centered someone is in society, the more they have difficulty with ambiguity because their boundaries of their world are hyper protected, right? So she's going to say that when it comes to whites and non-whites, the white people have their boundaries protected. I mean, sometimes very literally, not too long ago, it was literal segregation, and now we have de facto segregation, right? Where I can literally go in neighborhoods and not see too many people that are different, right? Or in the case of men, she says men often are the ones who have very strong problems with boundaries or with they want to maintain their own boundaries or their worldview. And it has to do with how, especially when she's writing, how they view women, how they view queer folk, right? How they view the world in a kind of more rigid way, enforcing. So those are some examples, right? And then, of course, in Mexican context, the Mexican people repress the indigenous part of themselves and around them. But the key thing in chapter 7 is that the boundaries you make on outside of you are also what you repress inside of you. So men repress the feminine in themselves. They don't have to, but they do, right? And she argues a lot of white Americans repress what they see as certain cultural traits of black or indigenous or Mexican American people. They repress those things in themselves, only able to release them in certain moments like clubs or to certain music. But other than that, they can't really do it all the time, and they attack it when it's outside. Say, "Oh, look at these people having kids out of wedlock or being so ratchet or things like that," right? And of course, Mexicans repress the indigenous in them, which she argues, right? But the mestiza, the woman who's blending of indigenous and Mexican and European ancestry, she can't help but be all three at once. And this is why, for her, the mestiza leads to a new form of consciousness, a new way of understanding being human, right? She's thinking really big, right? That humanity needs to move to a new direction where we're able to accept the ambiguity that we all exist on. So we all are living spectrums and continuums. There's no man that's doesn't have a feminine side. There's no Mexican that doesn't have an indigenous part of them. There's no white person who doesn't have something black or indigenous as a part of who they are. But there's a fear of that and a joy of dominating over that on the outside that you neglected on the inside. But for her, the mestiza woman is uniquely forced to confront those things because she is woman, she is indigenous, and she is European. She's white. She's all three. And so she says that in her consciousness, that normally manifests as what she calls ambivalence, as kind of a, okay, that's bad and that's bad and that's bad. All these things have their own bad things. I don't really know how to claim any of them, really, right? When I speak English, all the Mexican people say I'm bad. When I act American, all the Mexican people say I'm being elitist or these types of things, or I'm not really truly Mexican. Um, when I try to embrace my indigenous roots, the Mexicans around me are like, "Oh, that's you have a problem with you're not really that." When I'm try to act too masculine, the men tell me to get in my place, right? But if I act too feminine in what they imagine, then I'm too emotional and crazy and all these things, right? So I kind of can't win. And so she says he just shut down because it's a lot. She says there's a reason why a lot of people reject ambiguity because it's hard to accept that there's truth on all sides. It's hard to accept that there's value on all sides and truly live that out because they conflict with each other. They literally conflict inside yourself. And so, but she says that so the mestiza, she kind of shuts down a little bit. But then she says usually some type of traumatic event wakes her up to the all the different ambiguities, and she has to begin to choose more intentionally. And it's not an easy process to be in the middle. But for her, the middle is the place to be to go forward. Someone has to be able to wrestle with these contradictions, wrestle with these differences, wrestle with these opposing forces that really are inside of everybody. But some people can suppress them more so they can live more comfortably and easy, right? But the Chicana feminist, in her vision, is the one who goes to wrestle with those. You can almost think of her as a kind of priestess. You literally use that word, like a priestess or a shaman figure or something like that, spiritual leader who dives into the real unity underneath everything and is able to exist as a blend of things, right? And to her point, queerness is a big part of this too. She says that, hey, the feminist movement shouldn't demonize all men because there are what she calls tender men, but she's especially concerned about queer men. She believes that queer people can form, they belong as part of the feminist movement, and also they kind of have a universal appeal because she says the queer people in all countries around the world are rejected by their family. So it's a shared rejection that kind of can help them form a community together, right? And she says that that rejection that queer people face is similar to the rejection of that women face in their societies that are where women are oppressed. And she says because both are, for example, the men rejecting the feminine in themselves and women rejecting the masculine in themselves. And what is the greatest manifestation of that outside of you? Queer people, right? Who in her our minds can't help but embody these other kinds of energies, these other kinds of ways of being and who they are. So, with that being said, she says it's really important for us to embrace ambiguity, that things can be multiple things at the same time. And when we're thinking about, I encourage people to think about quantum computers when I get people to think about Gloria Anzaldua's thought. And so in quantum computing, in normal computing, a a bit is either a zero or a one, right? It's binary, right? And by being either a zero or a one, it can process tons of information, present everything that you're seeing on the screen right now. But in quantum computing, something can be a zero and a one at the same time, which exponentially increases its processing power. It doesn't have to be, it can be a zero, it can be a one, or it can be indeterminate. It can be a zero and one at the same time, or almost zero and one. And that's kind of what Going to do is teach for humanity is that we need to embrace that we are all these different possibilities at once. And then there can be an exponential growth, an exponential change in what it means to be a human, an exponential expansion of human possibility. But in her mind, most people are going to resist it. Only people who are forced to face all this possibility can gain the skills to navigate it and can help guide others and mediate between different groups. And she's the Mystique is the one to do that. And so she says near the end of chapter 7, I choose to be a mediator. She says, hey, there's lots of people that are black and Mexican American and indigenous. They say, I don't want to work with white people, right? Because they are going to center themselves too much and what they've built and what they've accomplished and what they deserve and what they, how it's not fair that I should. So I don't want to have that conversation, right? We all kind of know these types of things. But Gloria says, I choose to be a bridge. I choose to be a mediator. I think we need everybody. Right? I think we need to, I'm going to be the one to step in and say, hey, look, I have European ancestry. This tradition is a part of me as well. But so are these other ones. And I can tell you by being on the inside where the limitation in your perspective is. And I can go to the other side and say, hey, look, I can tell you what the other side has to offer, right? So she says, I'm white and I'm Mexican American. So I can say, hey, look, to the white community, here's some things, here's where your perspective is limited, right? But because I understand it, or I've worked to understand it because it's a part of me. Then I can go to Mexican Americans and say, hey, look, here's where the value of the white community and their perspective and what they have to offer you. Here's why you shouldn't reject them. We need to come together, right? She says it's very easy to want things to be simple, to say this is the bad person and to reject them, to have a strong boundary. But if there's one thing that Gloria Anzaldua takes very seriously is what we now call being non-binary, right? And non-binary for her means way more than just non-binary in terms of gender. That's just one. We need to go non-binary in all the different directions. So if our computers are going non-binary, certainly humans should be going non-binary, right? In a sense that we should be able to understand that all these different possibilities and richnesses are part of who we are, right? And so a lot of her language deals with unearthing what's repressed and accepting what's inside of you, accepting who you truly are. And though all people should do this, most people do not because there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of uncertainty. For a lot of men, if I embrace my that is, I've embraced my feminine side, but then I'm weak, then I'm vulnerable to other people, then I won't be strong, I don't know who I am, right? Or and it goes on for all the other ones. If for the Mexicans, if I embrace the indigenous in me, then I'm back at that part of me that's backwards and in the past and that failed to modernize and be civilized, and I don't want that, right? So, but if we can embrace what truly is a part of us, then the potential for who we are as human beings can expand and grow. So if there's anything I want you to take away from this, as I said, one is she takes non-binary as a theoretical perspective very sincerely, right? For her, just like we see it in physics, she would agree that it's the fundamental nature of the universe to be indeterminate, to be ambiguous, right? When we talk about indeterminacy now on the quantum level, right? That when you do an experiment at the particle level, the smallest level, things are not often either or. They exist in an indeterminate state until we measure them. Once we measure them, it changes their situation. There's a very simplified version of that. But Gloria Anzaldua believes that the fundamental the fundamental metaphysical principle of reality is ambiguity. Things are constantly changing and blending. And humans, by virtue of our limited perspective, we want to be in control of particular things. Like, this is my country, that's your country. Yet the goods flow so easily, right? Yet the United States can completely control and influence the lives of all of Mexico, yet can say, I have no obligation to you, you have no connection to me. You're like somewhere else, and yet you're coming here. It's so weird. I don't get why you're here, right? That's a denial of the fact that the United States has expanded its influence to have gobbled up Mexico, from Gloria's perspective. But if it would embrace the Mexico that's a part of itself, it could flourish, it could develop, it could do all these wonderful things by just embracing the fact that, yeah, we become such a dominant part of what happens in Mexico. We might as well just accept that Mexico is a part of what we are, right? But people get scared. Well, what about what we have established? What about this and that? And that's the fear of change that for Anzaldua comes from you being from a certain perspective. And all humans fear change. And change isn't necessarily easy, but it's always worth navigating, right? Remember, a lot of people said a democracy wouldn't work, the kind of democracy that we have. There are many arguments that the reason the British didn't fight so hard for the American Revolution is because they believed it wouldn't work. Obviously, you got to fight, but once the losses got too bad, they backed away because like a constitutional republic that's not going to work. But it did. But it wasn't easy. It was difficult in a lot of ways. And a lot of people had to fight, as we said with women, as one group, to be included into it. It has been a struggle. Democracy has been a struggle. It has been difficult. So, but a lot of us feel like it was worth it to have certain people that become now included and to have rights and expressions of ourselves in various kinds of ways. So that's all Gloria Anzaldua is saying. All right, until we talk again.